True. Let's go to Karma Green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirate lines, we break the bondage tight. Kamji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Chimpy drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kamji verse.
I speak a lot about how South Africans should move away from race-based categories like black and white to more ethnic-based categories like Tswana South African or native South African, which I identify and I think more accurately describes me. Because as we can see, I'm not black. I am brown. My skin is brown. My hair is black. And so these categories were made by racist people. And they don't tell the full story about us. And every time I call myself a native South African, there's always a colored person, at least one, in the video comments who says, get your facts right, you are not a native. The only native South Africans are the Khoi and the San, which for some reason colored South Africans have managed to claim. They've managed to claim themselves as the only Khoi and San descendants. Which is like a really shocking and misinformative narrative, especially as a Motswana girl. At 19 years old was the first time I ever heard this narrative, right? For most of my life, like every day of my life, I literally thought the San were Tswana. As in, multiple people in my family literally look like people who were called San Bushmen. The San were in the Kalahari at the same time as the Tswana were in the Kalahari or the Kalahari. So all of these people likely also mixed. And so when I heard that narrative, I was like, okay, they're clearly not speaking about me because I'm indigenous to South Africa from like the San, from like Marupeng basically. But thinking about that now, I think it's so highly problematic. I think it is a tool, a colonial tool, this misinformation about native South Africans being also colonizers, right? Bantu South Africans coming from Central, West, East Africa into Southern Africa and colonizing the Khoi.
And I think that the colonial, like the European colonial narrative is then that you are also colonizers just like us. But that's false, because this movement of people into the space, this congregation of peoples is natural. It happened naturally since 500 AD. And so all kinds of people mixed with the San that were in Southern Africa, including the Tswana, including the people who are now known as the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Ndebele. All of these people were here at the same time or at some period of time and intermixing with each other. And so I think that there's a large colored, so-called colored, I don't know, I want to move away from racial classifications, but this group of colored people who seem to believe that the Khoi and the San were here and that they waited only for the Europeans and the Indonesians and the Malaysians and they mixed with them only. And so only colored people in the country have San heritage and the rest of us don't. And I'm like, come on. Like, why can they be the only group that are mixed with the San and the rest of us, the San did not mix with the Bantus who were here for 500 years with them,
Now, I wanted to respond to this sister, Tswana sister, speaking about, some of the issues in South Africa with respect to racial classifications. Now, first off, while it is clear that racialization, came from the settler colony or, the Europeans who came into South Africa, whether it be the British, whether it be the Afrikaners and the Boers, that type of castigation rooted within the chattelization period certainly came from Europeans. However, color distinctions, that we can see throughout, the African continent, whether it be, among the Akan or Bibini, Adu, Lawo, and the Yoruba people, and the Isi-Oje for the Igbo people, or in classical Africa, where we're talking about Kemet or Kimi, right? We see certain indications of blackness as an identifier, blackness as pristine, blackness as fertile, blackness as power, authority. These are different things that have been associated with blackness, since time immemorial with respect to the Paleo-African context. And though there is some diversity among, different African populations, we are all rooted within the same pre-dialectical ancestor, which according to the Diop Obenga model would be the Kantiore culture of the Great Lakes region that participated into the Pharaonic civilization, as well as the civilizations in Central and Southern Africa that are now called Bantu. Now, with respect to Bantu and Khoisan, a lot of the different ethnic categories that are used within Southern Africa have to be corrected. Now, we speak very, very extensively on this channel about the Greenbergian phyla and about how many European scholars use mass comparison, within linguistics, particularly from the Greenbergian tradition, the tradition of Joseph Greenberg, to lump different African categories or different African languages into speculative categories without applying the rigorous diachronic linguistic approach. And this is where we get Hamido-Semitic, which became Afro-Asiatic. This is where we get Eastern and Western Sudanic, which became Negro or Niger-Congo and Nilo-Saharan. It's also where we get Khoisan. Now, according to conventional historical linguistics, the Khoisan language family is pretty much defunct. It is no longer seen as a valid category. And, it's basically seen as languages that are related via aerial diffusion or historical contact between each other. And the idea of a unified Khoisan people who were replaced and, deposed by the Bantus, doesn't stand up to scrutiny, right? Now, when we're looking at, a lot of this linguistic evidence and the lack of linguistic evidence for Khoisan, we have to reconsider whether or not the entire history that we've been told about, South Africa was alive. Because again, white scholars, primarily scholars such as Wilhelm Bleek, right? Scholars, preceding scholars such as Westermann and Guthrie, etc., they have spoken about the integrity of Bantu to fall in line with the apartheid era narrative that because Bantus migrated from Nigeria and Cameroon, according to their model, and migrated all the way down into Southern Africa and replaced and disposed of the so-called Khoisan people, which, the category is now considered as defunct in historical linguistics. But according to that model, because the so-called Bantus replaced the would-be Khoisan, this makes it valid for white people to come into South Africa and do whatever they want. And they argue for development, spreading so-called civilization, which is a more racialist or white supremacist, orientation of that narrative. But they use Bantu linguistics to try to argue for a Bantu Uber Eils, a mass genocide on the behalf of the Bantus against the Khoisan. Now, this is going to run into a lot of problems, particularly when we examine a lot of the evidences for this so-called Bantu family. Now, specifically, if we examine, the analysis within the UNESCO Symposium, who spoke about this issue in their general history of Africa, and they spoke about all of the different problems, there is a scholar by the name of Lun Yigo, right? And what this scholar did was he basically analyzed the Bantu narrative from a linguistic, archaeological, and a historical perspective. And what he found is that the Bantu myth mirrors the Hamitic myth. And what he's saying is that many of the advocates of Bantu outside of its position as a hypothetical category, a working hypothesis within linguistics, many of those Western scholars who promote Bantu as a legitimate, rigid population are perpetuators of Hamidicism. Many of the linguists in Carl Lespius, Wilhelm Bleek, Westermann, right? Many of the linguists of the Göttingen school and their descendants who, formulated the Bantu category were Hamidicist. Right? And they linked the Bantus and the civilizations that they were able to observe from the civilizations on the Swahili coast, the civilizations in Congo, Great Zimbabwe, to Caucasians who migrated into Africa and civilized the lowly Negro Africans, right? So there's a problem when we equate language, culture, and race. I Right now, I'm speaking Indo-European, English. That doesn't necessarily mean that my ancestors were predominantly Indo-European speakers. And in the text, Lunigo uses the example of the Bira people, where they have the same language spoken by forest farmers, savanna herders, and pygmy hunters, so-called pygmy hunters. And these people have different cultures, but they speak the same language. Likewise, the same culture in forest hunting is found among speakers of different Greenbergian categories like Bantu, Central Sudanic, and other languages. This directly undermines the idea of a unified Bantu race or a Bantu culture. Again, you could have the same language spoken by forest farmers, savanna herders, and foragers and hunter-gatherers, right? Same language, different culture, right? Versus same culture, different languages. So it's really difficult to use Bantu and try to associate it with the spread of ceramics, the spread of farming, the spread of ironworking, when there's a more multifaceted rendition of this narrative. And according to Luanga Lunigo within the UNESCO Symposium, he posited that, the Bantu migrations that scholars are referring to are the spread of now, Bantu populations, now so-called Bantu populations, was the result of a multi-generational and a multi-directional movement. Scholars such as Felix Chami have also articulated a similar point in stating that peoples of this so-called Bantu physical type or Negroid physical type occupied infra-Saharan Africa from the Middle Stone Age until now, right? And this is the analysis of these scholars. So they don't necessarily accept a one-way Nigeria-Cameroonian border migration into Central and Southern Africa. Absolutely, positively not. They do not accept this within the African-centered perspective, within the African-centered school, right? So we have to avoid promoting the Hamitic myth, which was used during the colonial period as a way of separating these different African populations, right? With respect to the relationship between the Bantus and the Khoisan in South Africa, we have what's called a trilemma. There's a trilemma with linguistics. There's a trilemma with archaeology. There's a trilemma with genetics, right? Linguistics has a problem of presence without time, in the sense that with respect to the data that we have of Bantu languages, there's no reliable way to establish an absolute timeline. The comparative method can show relative sequences or language splits, but cannot say when they happened. Techniques in mass comparison like glottochronology, which attempt to date language divergence, are widely considered unreliable and based on flawed assumptions about the constant rate of language change. Egger quotes critics who called new statistical methods just the discredited old lexicostatistics with glamorous graphics. So linguistics can provide a detailed map of relationships, but offers no reliable dates for the journey. Then you have archaeology, and this is material culture without language. It's the only field that provides an authentic time-specific evidence through excavated artifacts and radiocarbon dating. This is the strength of archaeology. But the weakness is there is no necessary link between material culture and language. Just because a certain type of pottery appears in the region doesn't mean the people who made it spoke a Bantu language. Pottery styles can be adopted through trade or imitation without population movement. So the archaeological record in the Congo Basin rainforest is extremely spotty. It's terra incognita, and the evidence is too sparse to trace a clear migratory route of people. So these evidences, these ceramic evidences, spotty, incongruous, different traditions in the Congo Basin that many of these scholars use to posit that the so-called Bantu speakers in Southern Africa must have migrated down and replaced the Khoisan is based upon a lack of evidence. So archaeology provides solid dates and material evidence, but cannot tell us what language those people spoke. Linking pottery to Bantu people is an assumption, not a proof at all. So here's the problem with genetics. Modern data for ancient events, right? Modern genetic data can reveal large-scale patterns of population mixing and migration, but its weakness, using modern DNA to reconstruct ancient history, is fraught with problems. Genetic studies often describe detailed genetic patterns, but then in their concluding paragraphs, speculatively link these patterns to historical migrations, like the Bantu expansion, by borrowing unproven assumptions from linguistics or archaeology. This creates circular reasoning. So if you have a linguistic hypothesis, an archaeological hypothesis, and then you mix this in with speculative statistical inferences in genetics, you have circular reasoning. So the acidic soils of the rainforest destroy skeletal remains, making it nearly impossible to get ancient DNA from the critical time period. Modern DNA is the product of thousands of years of mixing and cannot be cleanly mapped onto ancient population movements. And coevolution is not guaranteed. The theory that genes and languages always evolve together is just an assumption. There are many historical examples of people adopting a new language without a major genetic shift. An example of this is through trade dominance or political conquest. A mismatch between genetic and linguistic data doesn't automatically mean one is wrong. It might mean the coevolution model is too simple. Genetic provides compelling patterns but struggles to connect them conclusively to specific historical events without relying on the other, already problematic disciplines. So the trilemma arises when you try to combine these three fields to get a single coherent history, such as in the Bantu model. Each one lacks a crucial piece of information that it tries to borrow from another, creating circular and ultimately ungrounded arguments. Linguistic needs absolute dates from archaeology. Archaeology needs to link artifacts to a language from linguistics, and genetics needs a historical framework to interpret its data, which it borrows from both linguistics and archaeology. If you question the assumption of one field, the entire interdisciplinary house of cards threatens to collapse. You cannot definitively prove the link between a pot, a word, and a gene from this period. Therefore, any historical narrative built from combining them is, according to Eggert's skeptical view, ultimately a just-so story pulled up by its own bootstraps, like Baron Munchausen's pulling himself out of the swamp by his own hair, right? So in sum, the Bantu trilemma, especially as it relates to the relationship between so-called Bantu and so-called Khoisan populations, means that any attempt to explain the so-called Bantu expansion from the Nigeria-Cameroonian border into Central and Southern Africa is stuck with three bad options. One, infinite regress, constantly needing more data from one field to support the speculative claims of another in an endless chain. Circular reasoning, using the conclusions of linguistics in linguistic mass comparison to interpret genetic data, and then using the genetic data to confirm the linguistic mass comparison hypothesis. And then you have arbitrary assumptions, simply stopping the questioning and accepting a link. This pottery style must be Bantu, without definitive proof. So we should exercise extreme caution in this regard and promote true interdisciplinary work that requires a deep understanding of the limitations of each field, rather than simply borrowing their speculative conclusions to plug into one's own model. So the Bantu expansion is a profound historical enigma in genetics, and it has not been solved in genetics, linguistics, or archaeology, or even the general history of the African continent for that matter, because the work of Africana scholars has not been considered. If we look at scholars such as, Ndigi, who affirmed a genetic relationship between the Bassa language of Cameroon and the ancient Pharaonic language. If we look at the work of Dika Akwanyambo Nambela, the work of Gilbert Ngom, who used historical linguistics to connect the Sawa or Douala language to the Pharaonic culture. If we look at the numerous scholars, from Mubabingi Balolo, Nkuka and onwards, who have engaged within this analysis, Felix Chami, as we mentioned before, who have engaged within this analysis to be able to provide just a working model of the relationship between classical Africa and contemporary, modern African populations, from the toponyms, Ngala and Chaka, to even some of the phylogenetic trees in EM 293. that you see migrating from Northeast Africa into Central and Southern Africa, whether it's the lactase persistence markers, where you see Eastern African lactase persistence markers migrating southward into Central and Southern Africa, the kinase domain receptor or hair analysis that shows, a lot of these East African pastoralists are related to, ancient Kerma, the ancient Kerma and Kadruga population that migrated south. You see the canine mesioridge and the LO haplotype that is even seen from the Adaima population in Upper Egypt to modern Central and Southern Africa among the so-called Bantu or Chiaga populations, as well as the Khoisan, and on and on and on. There's so much different evidence linking the populations of Inner Africa to the Pharaonic civilization, basically affirming the model of the Great Lakes region origin of the pre-dialectical ancestor of Paleo-African speakers being the Kantiore culture, right? This is stuff that has been heavily documented and studied for decades by Africana scholars in historical linguistics, archaeology, and even applying genetics and mainly medical genetics as opposed to population genetics. Jean-Philippe Gourdin's analysis, where he deals with the schistosomes that migrated from the Great Lakes region to the Pharaonic civilization and then subsequently to West, Central, and Southern Africa. Whether you're dealing with Middle Kingdom tuberculosis, where you see the L5 and L6 strain in Senegambia that's also in the Middle Kingdom. Whether you're dealing with leprosy analysis, where you see leprosy, types in Abu Sir during the late period that are also found among Afro-Brazilians and Martinique, or sickle cell anemia, the Benin HBS sickle cell haplotype that's seen within the Pharaonic civilization that originated in West Africa during the Holocene, and on and on and on. There is so much numerous evidence linking the populations of the African continent together, in unity, especially when it comes to the onomastics and the fact that we use different versions of Black, to describe ourselves. This is very, very clear. So we shouldn't be allowing colonial propaganda to separate us. We should just realize that we are much united and stronger together. So that's all I got on this. I hope to catch you on the next one. Peace.
True as gold, a comma green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kanji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Shimpy drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kanji verse.